Speaker.
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 Drugs.
Speaker. Community. Speaker.
Speaker. Committee.
Prescription. Speaker. Prescription drugs. Speaker. Prescription drugs. Prescription drugs. Prescription drugs. Prescription. Speaker.
Speaker.
Speaker. Prescription drugs. Prescription drugs. Trump. Speaker. Drugs. Drugs.
Speaker. Prescription. 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 Prescription drugs. Prescription. Prescription. Prescription drugs. Prescription drugs. Committee. Committee. Prescription drugs. Prescription drugs. Drugs. Prescription drugs. Prescription. Speaker.
Speaker. Drugs.
Speaker. Drugs Committee.
Speaker. Prescription drugs. Prescription.
The saying drugs, drugs, drugs. Speaker.
Speaker. Prescription drugs. Speaker.
Speaker. Speaker.
Speaker.
Speaker. Drugs.
Speaker. Prescription drugs. Prescription drugs. 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 Prescription drugs.
Prescription drugs. Speaker.
Speaker. Prescription drugs. Coming.
Speaker.
Speaker. Prescription drugs. Prescription drugs.
Committee. Prescription drug. Drugs. Drugs. Prescription.
Committee. Prescription drugs.
Prescription drugs.
Speaker. Prescription. Prescription.
Drugs. Committee. Drugs. Speaker.
Speaker.
Prescription drugs. Drugs. Prescription drugs.
Prescription drugs. Prescription drugs. Drug. Prescription. Speaker. Drugs. 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 Committee. Prescription drugs. Committee. Drugs.
Speaker.
Prescription. Prescription drugs. Prescription.
Speaker. Speaker. Speaker.
Speaker.
Speaker. Prescription drugs. Committee. Prescription drugs. Prescription by more than community. Prescription drugs. Prescription.
Speaker.
Committee. Prescription drugs.
Speaker.
OMA. Drugs. Prescription.
Speaker. Speaker. Prescription drugs. Prescription American prescription drugs. Speaker.
Amendment. Committee. Amendment.
Prescription. Committee.
Speaker. Amendment. Drugs. Amendment. Prescription drugs.
Committee.
Speaker.
Amendment. Drugs. Go back. Drugs. Amendment.
Committee.
Amendment.
Drugs. Amendment. Drugs. Amendment. Committee. Prescription amendment.
Prescription drugs. Prescription. Speaker. Drugs. Prescription drugs.
Committee. Amendment.
Amendment.
Prescription drugs. Drugs Committee. Amendment. Directs amendment.
Drugs. Amendment.
Prescription drugs. Amendment. Drugs. Amendment.
Amendment.
Committee. Amendment.
Amendment.
Committee. Amendment. Committee. Amendment. Committee. Amendment. Committee. Amendment.